Stay with me. Because the moment her wedding ring hit the floor, everything he thought he controlled began to fall apart. The sound wasn't loud, not like a crash or a scream, just a faint metallic tap against polished marble. But in that quiet hospital corridor it echoed like a warning no one understood yet, and Emily Carter felt it before she saw it, that subtle shift in the air, that cold absence where warmth used to live, as if something invisible had just been taken from her future without permission. She stood there at 7 months pregnant, one hand resting instinctively over her belly, feeling the steady movement of the life inside her, grounding her, reminding her that no matter how distant her husband had become, she still had something real, something unbreakable, or at least that's what she believed in that moment. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale glow over her reflection in the glass doors ahead, a reflection she barely recognized anymore, not because of how she looked, but because of what she had slowly become, quieter, smaller, more careful with every word, every step, every breath around a man who used to look at her like she was the center of his world and now barely looked at her at all. Richard Carter had built an empire from nothing, or at least that was the story he told in interviews, the self-made millionaire who turned grit into gold, the man who could close deals across 3 time zones before breakfast, the man who never lost, and somewhere along the way, Emily had become just another asset in that empire, something to manage, something to control, something to silence when it became inconvenient. She remembered the way he used to hold her hand in public, the way people admired them, whispered about how perfect they looked together, beauty and power wrapped into one flawless image. But perfection has a cost, and Emily had been paying it quietly for months, maybe years, without realizing how high the price had become. The first crack didn't come with a fight or a confession, it came with silence, long nights where Richard stopped coming home, messages left unanswered, excuses that didn't quite make sense but were delivered with such confidence that questioning them felt like a mistake she couldn't afford to make, and then came the distance, not physical at first, but something colder, something sharper, like a door closing 1 inch at a time until there was nothing left but a narrow gap she could no longer see through. That morning had started like any other, routine wrapped in fragile normalcy. But there was something different in the way Richard looked at her before he left, not anger, not even irritation, just calculation, like he was measuring something she couldn't see, weighing options she didn't know existed. And when he walked out the door without saying goodbye, Emily felt it again, that quiet shift. Like the world had tilted just slightly off balance. What she didn't know, what no one in that hallway could have known, was that the life she thought she was protecting was already being rewritten behind her back, that the name she carried, the identity she trusted, the marriage she believed in, were all pieces of a larger design she had never been meant to understand, and somewhere not far from that hospital, a decision had already been made. One that would erase everything she thought she knew and replace it with a truth far more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. Because some men don't just walk away from the women who trust them, they rewrite their existence entirely. And in doing so, they forget one critical thing: truth doesn't disappear, it waits. The next memory Emily would hold on to was the sound of her own breathing, uneven and unfamiliar, like she had borrowed someone else's lungs and forgotten how to use them properly. And when her eyes opened, the world did not return all at once but in fragments, light first, then shadow, then the faint outline of a ceiling that did not belong to the life she remembered. And for a moment she did not move because something inside her understood before her mind did that nothing would feel the same again. Machines whispered around her, soft rhythmic signals that measured time in seconds and survival in numbers, and somewhere to her right a monitor traced a steady line that confirmed what mattered most, that the child she carried was still there, still fighting quietly inside her, still unaware that everything outside had changed. Emily tried to speak but the attempt dissolved into silence, her throat dry, her voice caught somewhere between fear and confusion, and it was then she noticed the stillness of her own body, the heaviness, the careful positioning, as if even the smallest movement required permission she no longer had. A nurse stepped into view, her expression composed but gentle, the kind of calm that comes from experience, not reassurance, and she said Emily's name slowly, clearly, like she was guiding her back from somewhere far away. And Emily held on to that sound because it was the only thing that felt certain, her name, her identity, the one thing she believed had not been taken from her. But even that certainty began to fracture as minutes passed and fragments of memory returned in uneven waves, the corridor, the silence, the metallic tap of her ring, and then nothing, a blank space where something significant should have been, a missing piece that refused to reveal itself no matter how hard she reached for it. Outside the room, voices moved in low tones, controlled, deliberate, and one of them stood out, steady and authoritative, the voice of a man used to making decisions that others followed without question, and when he finally entered, Emily felt it immediately, that same shift she had sensed before everything changed, not fear exactly, but recognition, as if this moment had been waiting for him long before she arrived. Dr. Daniel Hayes did not introduce himself with unnecessary words, he simply stepped closer, his eyes focused, not clinical in the detached way most doctors carried themselves, but searching, attentive, like he was looking beyond the obvious, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, each word placed carefully as if the truth required precision, and he told her she was safe, that her condition was stable, that her recovery would take time, and Emily listened because she had no other choice. But something in the way he paused, just slightly, just enough to be noticed, told her there was more he was not saying. Days passed in a rhythm that felt both slow and relentless, marked by procedures, quiet conversations, and the constant presence of machines that never stopped observing her, and through it all, one question began to grow louder in her mind, not what had happened, but why. Because absence creates its own kind of truth, and the silence surrounding her condition felt intentional, controlled. Like pieces of a story being withheld until the right moment. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Carter continued his life without interruption, appearing in meetings, speaking to investors, maintaining the image he had built so carefully, and if anyone noticed the slight change in his demeanor, the sharper edge in his tone, the way he avoided certain questions, they did not say it out loud, because power has a way of silencing curiosity before it becomes dangerous. But truth does not need permission to surface, it only needs time, and in a quiet office far from the hospital, a file sat open under a single lamp, its contents reviewed more than once, details cross-checked, signatures examined, and at the center of it all was a name that did not match the story everyone believed, a name that connected Emily Carter to something far greater than a marriage, something that would not stay hidden for long. Because the moment she opened her eyes, the timeline had already begun to shift, and what was meant to erase her would soon become the very thing that exposed everything. Recovery did not arrive as a single moment but as a series of quiet realizations, each one sharper than the last, and Emily Carter began to understand that healing was not about returning to who she had been but learning how to exist as someone entirely new, someone who no longer fit into the life she remembered, and the first sign came not from her body but from the silence surrounding her husband's absence. Because in the days that followed, Richard never appeared, not once, not even for a moment that could be explained away as obligation or concern, and that absence spoke louder than any explanation he could have offered. The hospital staff never said his name unless Emily asked, and when she did, their answers were careful, measured, like they had been instructed to remain neutral, but neutrality has a shape, and Emily could feel it pressing against the edges of every conversation, reminding her that something was being managed beyond her reach. Dr. Daniel Hayes continued to oversee her treatment with the same composed precision, but there were moments when his attention lingered, not on her condition, but on the documents attached to her case, moments when his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, as if a question had formed that he could not yet answer, and Emily noticed because she had learned to read silence long before she understood it. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin, pale lines across the room, Daniel stood at the foot of her bed reviewing her file, turning a page, then stopping, then turning it back again, a small detail, easily missed, but not by someone who had spent months noticing the smallest changes in the man she once trusted. Emily's voice, still fragile but steadier than before, broke the quiet when she asked him a question that had been building since she woke up, not what had happened, but why no one would tell her the full story, and for the first time, Daniel did not respond immediately. He closed the files slowly, deliberately, and met her eyes with a seriousness that carried more weight than any diagnosis. And he told her that sometimes the truth does not arrive all at once because it changes everything it touches. That answer did not comfort her, but it confirmed what she already suspected, that the version of events she had been given was incomplete, and incomplete truths are often more dangerous than lies because they leave space for something worse to exist. Across the city, in a glass office overlooking a skyline built on ambition and control, Richard Carter signed documents with the same steady hand that had built his reputation, his movements efficient, his tone unwavering. But beneath that surface, something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, a tension that revealed itself in the way he double-checked certain clauses. In the way he paused before approving transfers that should have been routine, as if he was ensuring that every detail aligned with a plan only he understood. What Richard did not know was that the plan had already begun to unravel in a place he could not control, inside a medical archive where older records were being reviewed, cross-referenced, and questioned, and at the center of that review was a discrepancy that should not have existed, a birth record that did not match a name, a signature that traced back to a different history, and a connection that tied Emily Carter to a past that had never been disclosed. Back in the hospital, Emily rested her hand over her belly, feeling the quiet movement within, a reminder that time was moving forward whether she was ready or not, and as she closed her eyes, she realized something that changed. The way she saw everything that had happened, that this was never about a single moment, or a single decision, it was about a sequence of choices made long before she understood their meaning, and somewhere within that sequence was the truth she had not yet been given, a truth that was no longer hiding but waiting, because when identity is questioned, everything else follows. And Emily was beginning to understand that the life she thought had been taken from her might never have belonged to her at all. Truth does not arrive with noise, it arrives in details that refuse to stay hidden, and for Emily Carter, it began with a single question that no one in the room was prepared to answer, not because they did not know, but because they were not sure how much she was ready to hear, and readiness, as Dr. Daniel Hayes had come to understand, was no longer something he could measure with medical charts or recovery timelines. It happened on a quiet morning when the hospital felt almost suspended in stillness, the kind of stillness that makes every small sound feel deliberate, and Daniel stood once again with her file in his hands. But this time he was not reviewing her condition, he was reviewing her identity, and the difference between those two things had become impossible to ignore. Emily watched him from the bed, her instincts sharper now, no longer clouded by confusion, because something inside her had shifted from fear to awareness, and awareness has a way of demanding answers even when answers are inconvenient. She asked him directly, not about her injuries, not about her recovery, but about the records he kept reading, the pages he kept returning to, and this time, Daniel did not deflect, he did not offer a measured response or a controlled explanation, instead he placed the file down carefully, as if the act itself carried weight, and he told her that her medical history did not begin where she thought it did. The words settled slowly, deliberately, and Emily felt the meaning before she fully understood it, because identity is not just a name, it is a timeline, and when that timeline fractures, everything connected to it begins to shift. Daniel explained that during a routine cross-reference of her blood work and archived records, something did not align, a discrepancy that could not be explained by clerical error or outdated documentation, and when he followed that discrepancy further, it led to a sealed file, one that required authorization he should not have had, but somehow did, and inside that file was a birth record with a different surname, a different hospital, and a notation that indicated a private transfer. The kind that does not appear in standard systems unless someone is intentionally looking for it. Emily listened without interrupting, her hand resting over her stomach, feeling the quiet rhythm of the life she was still protecting, and as Daniel spoke, the room seemed to narrow around a single realization, that the story she had lived her entire life was built on information she had never been given the chance to question. Across the city, Richard Carter received a call that lasted less than 60 seconds, but it was enough to disrupt the controlled pattern he had maintained since everything changed, and for the first time, the certainty in his voice faltered, just slightly, just enough to reveal that something had reached him, something he had not anticipated, because even the most carefully constructed plans depend on one assumption: that the past will remain buried. Back in the hospital, Daniel hesitated before saying the next part, not because he doubted its accuracy, but because of what it would mean, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that could not be softened. He told Emily that the name in that sealed file matched his own family records, records he had not looked at in years, records connected to a loss that had never been explained, and in that moment, the distance between doctor and patient dissolved into something far more complicated, because the truth was no longer abstract, it was personal. Emily did not react immediately, she did not question or deny, she simply absorbed the information in silence, because silence had become her way of understanding before responding, and as the weight of what she had just heard settled in, she realized something that changed everything, that this was never just about what had been done to her, it was about who she had always been, and the two were now impossible to separate. Because when truth begins to surface, it does not ask permission, it reveals itself completely, and the only question left is whether those involved are ready to face what comes next. Some truths do not break you when you hear them, they reshape you slowly, from the inside out, and Emily Carter felt that transformation begin not as shock but as a quiet, steady recalibration of everything she thought she knew about herself, because if her past had been constructed, then her future was no longer bound by it, and that realization did not frighten her the way it should have, it steadied her. Dr. Daniel Hayes remained standing beside her bed, the file now closed but its contents impossible to contain, and for the first time since she had woken up, Emily did not feel like a patient waiting for answers, she felt like someone who had just been handed a question powerful enough to change everything. She asked him what it meant, not in terms of records or discrepancies, but in terms of reality, and Daniel answered with the same precision he had carried from the beginning. He told her that the sealed file indicated she had been transferred as an infant under private authorization, that the surname Carter did not originate from her birth record, and that the family connected to that original record had reported a missing child decades ago, a case that had never been resolved. The words did not land all at once, they unfolded, piece by piece, and Emily felt the weight of them settle into something deeper than confusion, something closer to clarity, because the gaps in her memory, the subtle inconsistencies she had ignored over the years, the feeling that something had always been slightly out of place, they were no longer abstract, they had a source. Daniel hesitated before continuing, not out of uncertainty but out of respect for what the next truth would carry, and when he spoke again, his voice softened in a way that revealed something personal beneath the professional surface. He told her that the family connected to that file was his own, that a child had been lost under circumstances that were never fully explained, and that the timeline, the medical markers, and the genetic indicators now pointed in one direction that neither of them could dismiss. Emily held his gaze, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that might suggest this was a mistake, but what she found instead was something far more difficult to process, certainty restrained by responsibility. And in that moment, she understood that this was not a coincidence, it was a convergence, two lives intersecting because the truth had finally found a way through. Across the city, Richard Carter stood alone in his office, the skyline behind him reflecting a version of control that was beginning to fracture, because the call he had received was not just unexpected, it was precise, it referenced documents he believed were secured, timelines he believed were buried, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that the foundation of his plan was not as stable as he had assumed. Back in the hospital room, Emily shifted slightly, her movement careful but deliberate, and rested both hands over her stomach, grounding herself in the one certainty that remained untouched by all of this, the life she was still carrying forward, and as she breathed in slowly, she made a decision that did not need to be spoken out loud. She would not allow the truth to be managed, contained, or delayed any longer. Daniel watched her with a quiet understanding, recognizing the shift not just in her awareness but in her resolve, because recovery is not only physical, it is the moment a person decides they are no longer defined by what was done to them, and in that moment, Emily was no longer waiting for the next step, she was becoming it. The file that had started as a discrepancy was now something else entirely, a key to a past that had been hidden, and a future that was about to change direction, because when identity is reclaimed, power follows, and neither of them could ignore what that meant, not for her, not for the child she carried, and certainly not for the man who believed he had already erased both. Reconstruction is not a single procedure, it is a process that demands patience, discipline, and a willingness to face a reflection that changes day by day, and Emily Carter entered that process with a clarity that surprised even Dr. Daniel Hayes, because while her body required careful attention and time, her mind had already moved forward, already begun to align itself with the truth that no longer allowed her to remain passive. The days that followed were structured with precision, each hour planned, each step measured, and yet beneath that structure, something far more significant was unfolding, a transformation that went beyond recovery, something closer to reclamation. Daniel approached each stage of her treatment with the same focus he had shown from the beginning, but now there was an added weight to every decision, not just because of her condition, but because of what she represented, a connection to a past he had not expected to revisit, and a responsibility he could not ignore. Emily noticed the difference in the way he spoke to her, not softer, not more cautious, but more direct, as if he recognized that she no longer needed to be shielded from the reality of what she was facing, and in return, she met that directness with a steadiness that came from understanding what was at stake. During one of the longer sessions, as afternoon light stretched across the room in quiet lines, Daniel paused, setting aside the instruments he had been reviewing, and looked at her not as a patient, but as someone standing at the edge of a decision that would define everything that came next, and he asked her a question that carried more weight than any medical choice. He asked her whether she was ready to let the truth become public. Emily did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the scope of what that question meant. It was not just about revealing records or correcting a name, it was about shifting power, about stepping into a reality where the narrative could no longer be controlled by someone else. She placed her hand over her stomach, feeling the quiet, steady movement within, and in that moment, the answer became clear in a way that required no hesitation. She nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried the force of everything she had endured and everything she was about to become. Across the city, Richard Carter reviewed a series of documents that had begun to surface in places they should not have been, inquiries from legal teams, requests for clarification, subtle but unmistakable signs that the controlled environment he had relied on was being disrupted, and while his outward composure remained intact, the calculations behind it were shifting, adjusting to variables he had not anticipated, because control depends on predictability, and unpredictability had just entered the equation. Back in the hospital, Emily continued her recovery with a focus that transformed each step into something purposeful. She learned how to speak with greater strength, how to move with renewed balance, how to look at herself without turning away, and with each passing day, the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming grew wider, not in loss, but in power. Daniel began coordinating with individuals outside the hospital, quietly, carefully, ensuring that when the truth emerged, it would do so with clarity and evidence, not speculation, because truth, when revealed without structure, can be dismissed, but when supported, it becomes undeniable. Emily understood this without needing it explained, and as she prepared for what would come next, she realized something that reshaped the way she viewed everything that had happened, that the attempt to erase her had not weakened her, it had removed every limitation she had unknowingly accepted, and in that absence, something stronger had taken its place. The process was not complete, not yet, but it no longer needed to be, because the moment she chose to step forward, the outcome had already begun to shift, and somewhere beyond the walls of that hospital, the consequences of that choice were already in motion, waiting for the moment they could no longer be contained. The moment before everything changes is rarely loud, it is quiet, deliberate, almost invisible to anyone who is not paying attention, and for Emily Carter, that moment arrived not in a courtroom or in front of cameras, but in the reflection she saw one early morning as sunlight stretched across the hospital mirror, a reflection that no longer carried hesitation, no longer searched for approval, but stood with a calm certainty that could not be undone. She adjusted her posture slowly, feeling the balance she had rebuilt step by step, day by day, and for the first time since waking up, she did not see someone recovering, she saw someone ready. Dr. Daniel Hayes stood nearby, reviewing final reports. But his focus shifted when he noticed the change, not in her appearance, but in her presence, the way she held herself, the way she met her own reflection without turning away, and he understood without needing it explained that the process had reached a point no medical chart could define. He stepped closer, placing a document on the table beside her, not as a formality, but as confirmation, the evidence they had been preparing, verified. Organized, ready to be presented, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, because the weight of what was about to happen did not require words. Across the city, Richard Carter received formal notice, not a warning, not a rumor, but documentation that carried authority, requests for appearance, demands for disclosure, and while his office remained as immaculate as ever, the stillness inside it had changed, the kind of stillness that comes not from control, but from pressure building beneath the surface. He read through each page with precision, his expression unchanged, but the rhythm of his breathing shifted just enough to reveal what he would never admit, that the situation had moved beyond calculation, beyond strategy, into something far more dangerous, something he could not simply redirect or contain. Back at the hospital, Emily took a slow breath, steady and measured, her hand resting over her stomach as the life inside her responded with a quiet movement, grounding her once again, reminding her of what truly mattered, and as she turned away from the mirror, she did not look back, because she no longer needed to. The preparation moved quickly after that, coordinated with care, each detail aligned to ensure that when the truth emerged, it would do so with clarity that could not be questioned, and Daniel remained at her side not just as a surgeon, but as someone whose own past had now become inseparable from hers, because what had started as a case had become something far more personal, something that demanded resolution. The day arrived without spectacle, no dramatic entrance, no announcement, just a quiet progression toward a moment that had been set in motion long before anyone realized it, and as Emily stepped forward into that space, she carried with her not just evidence, but identity, not just recovery, but purpose, and in that moment, the narrative shifted completely. Because she was no longer the person the world believed her to be, she was the truth they had failed to see. Richard entered from the opposite side, composed, controlled, every movement calculated as it had always been, but there was something different now, something beneath the surface that could not be disguised, because for the first time, he was not the one directing the outcome, he was responding to it. Emily did not speak immediately, she allowed the silence to settle, to stretch. Just long enough for its meaning to be felt, and when she finally lifted her gaze, it was not toward him, but toward the truth that had been prepared, documented, and now placed before everyone who needed to see it, and in that moment, everything he had built began to lose its foundation, not because of force, but because of fact, because truth does not need to raise its voice, it only needs to be seen, and once it is, nothing remains the same. The room did not react immediately, and that was what made the moment so powerful, because when truth enters a space that has been built on control, it does not need applause or outrage, it creates a silence that forces everyone present to reconsider what they thought they understood, and Emily Carter stood at the center of that silence with a composure that could not be shaken, her presence steady, her gaze unwavering. Not directed at Richard Carter, but at the evidence that now spoke louder than any defense he could offer. The documents were presented one by one, not rushed, not dramatized, but methodical, each page building on the last, creating a sequence that revealed not just a single action, but a pattern, a design that connected financial transfers, identity records, and decisions made long before this moment. And as the timeline unfolded, it became clear that what had been hidden was never random, it had been calculated. Richard remained seated, his posture controlled, his expression composed in the way that had defined him for years. But there was a shift in his stillness, subtle but undeniable, because stillness born from confidence is different from stillness born from constraint, and for the first time, he was no longer dictating the pace of what was happening around him. Dr. Daniel Hayes stepped forward when it was time, not as a witness of circumstance, but as someone whose connection to the truth could no longer be separated from the facts themselves, and when he spoke, His voice carried the weight of both professional authority and personal history, explaining the discrepancies, the sealed records, the genetic confirmations that aligned Emily's identity with a past that had been intentionally obscured, and as he spoke, the narrative shifted completely. Because Emily was no longer positioned as someone who had lost everything, she was revealed as someone who had been removed from what was always hers. The revelation did not arrive as a single statement, it unfolded, detail by detail, until the connection could no longer be denied, until the name that had once been hidden was now recognized, and with that recognition came a shift in power that no one in the room could ignore. Emily did not interrupt, she did not rush to claim anything, she allowed the truth to settle, to be seen, to be understood without interference, because she knew something that others were only beginning to realize, that when truth is complete, it does not require reinforcement. Across the room, Richard's attention moved from the documents to Emily for the first time, not with anger, not with dismissal, but with a calculation that had lost its certainty, as if he was attempting to reconstruct a plan that no longer aligned with reality, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by control, it was defined by consequence. The final piece was presented without emphasis, a confirmation that connected the identity records to ownership structures that had been assumed to belong to Richard's empire, and as that connection became clear, the implications extended beyond personal betrayal into something far more significant, because the authority he had exercised was now being questioned at its foundation. Emily finally spoke then, her voice steady, clear, carrying through the silence without force. And she did not raise accusations or seek validation, she simply acknowledged what had been established, that the life she had been living was not a coincidence, that her identity had been altered, and that the consequences of that alteration were now visible to everyone present. No one moved immediately, because the moment required understanding before reaction, and as that understanding settled, the structure that had supported Richard's certainty began to shift in a way that could not be reversed, not through argument, not through influence, but through the simple fact that the truth had been seen, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Consequences do not always arrive with chaos, sometimes they settle in quietly, reshaping everything with a precision that cannot be undone, and as the room absorbed what had been revealed, Emily Carter understood that this was not the end of something, it was the beginning of a life that no longer required permission to exist. No one rushed to speak. No one attempted to interrupt the weight of what had just been established, because the truth had already done what it needed to do, it had shifted the balance, and in that shift, every role in the room had changed. Richard Carter remained still, but the stillness no longer belonged to him, it surrounded him, defined him, and for the first time, it limited him, because control is only effective when it is believed, and belief had just been replaced by certainty. Emily did not look at him again. Not out of avoidance, but because she no longer needed to. The connection that once defined her had been reduced to a fact that no longer carried power over her, and that realization freed her in a way that no outcome could have achieved on its own. Dr. Daniel Hayes stood beside her, not as a protector, not as a guide, but as someone who had witnessed the full arc of what had been uncovered, and in his expression there was no triumph, only resolution, because the truth had not been created, it had been revealed, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. As the proceedings moved forward, decisions were made with clarity, not influenced by emotion, not redirected by influence, but grounded in what had been proven, and while the formal outcomes would take time to unfold, their direction was no longer in question, because once a foundation is exposed as incomplete, everything built upon it must be reevaluated. Emily stepped back slightly, her movement calm, measured, her hand resting once more over her stomach, feeling the steady presence within her, and in that moment, the contrast between what had been taken and what remained became clear, because despite everything that had been altered, controlled, or hidden, something essential had endured, something that could not be rewritten. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware of the shift that had just occurred within those walls. But change does not require recognition to exist, it only requires momentum, and momentum had already begun. Richard's world would continue, but not in the way he had designed, not with the certainty he had relied on, Because certainty built on incomplete truth cannot sustain itself once the full picture is seen, and what remained would no longer belong solely to him. Emily turned toward the exit without hesitation, her steps steady, her posture aligned with a future she had not been allowed to see until now, and as she crossed that threshold, she did not carry the past with her,